Hi class. Today we're going to talk about suprasegmentals. So let me share my screen with you and we will get started. Okay. All right. Let me get started on this. Okay. Suprasegmentals. So suprasegmentals is really the aspects that go beyond phonemic segments in speech. So we've been talking a lot about sounds, first vowels, and consonants, but this is really information. Think of it as like a layer on top of what you already know about phonemes. So suprasegmental, supra, right? That affix means above and beyond something, right? So supra for what we're talking about means that we can apply some of these concepts to syllables, to words, to phrases, um, to structured speech versus conversational speech. So these elements are not just particular to what we've been doing, which is really sound transcription and word transcription. Um, Suprasegmentals are very important for a number of reasons. They're important for social communication, so how others perceive our message. So the tone that we use, the rate of speech we use, the pauses we take during a conversation. Um, these are social rules that we learned, and they are also sensitive to our culture as well. And we're going to talk about that as we go through this presentation today. Okay, so I have a little disclaimer on the top of this because terminology can be different depending on who is using the terms. So if you are strictly someone who's studying phonetics, you would make a very clear distinction between prosody and paralinguistics. So in your text, it makes a clear delineation that prosody is referring to linguistic properties that exceed the phoneme segment, where paralinguistics is really usually pertaining more to the mechanics. So voice quality as well as emotion. Um, so, and vocal adjustments. So in speech pathology, in the speech therapy world, we would kind of put all of this under a big umbrella. And that umbrella we're going to talk about in a second. Sorry, my computer's not cooperating. Um, so the umbrella that we usually refer to this under is really social communication and the area of language called pragmatics. So I don't want you to get too hung up on the distinctions between them again, from a phonetics textbook perspective, these are two different things. But in therapy world, we would kind of combine these and sometimes use them interchangeably. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. And we'll talk about it a little bit more as we go through the presentation. Okay. So one of the areas under paralinguistics is voice quality. And this is often something we look at when we do what's called an oral mech or oral mechanism exam. So when we're examining a child or an adult, we look at their features and we listen to their voice. And this is important for a number of reasons. One reason it's important is if their voice quality is distorted, it may be a sign that there's something physical is going on. So maybe their tonsils or adenoids are enlarged, or there's something structurally different, such as a cleft palate. So voice quality is important from a diagnostic perspective. But we also are going to learn about some diacritics, which are little marks that we use in IPA to emphasize differences that are not phonemic necessarily. So voice quality there's special diacritics for voice quality in the IPA, and we're going to learn about that in the narrow transcription lecture. So I just want you to be aware when you hear some of the terminology, such as a breathy voice quality or creaky, that there are symbols that we use to mark that when we are transcribing in IPA. Okay. So as I mentioned, there's some discussion about whether paralinguistics and prosody should be separated. Um, as I mentioned, this really falls under an umbrella, and the umbrella of social communication skills. So although loudness may be considered paralinguistic, we are looking at loudness sometimes from a more pragmatic or social skills area. So if a child doesn't know how to regulate their volume, that can be looked at as a problem with pragmatics because their peers might be irritated by them if they don't know how to talk at a typical range. Okay. Um, Emotion in speech is also listed under paralinguistics, but again, we look at that really from a pragmatics perspective sometimes. So, for example, a child who's autistic may use a monotone voice along with what we call as flat affect, so not a lot of expression. So, although the book makes a point of paralinguistics is more like the mechanics, and when we think about pragmatics and social skills, some of these areas are going to overlap. So I just want you to be aware of that. Okay. So let's talk about intonation. So this is part of prosody, and we often talk about what we call intonation contours. So we have rising, fall, and pitch when we're talking. And I'm going to show you a graph of that in a second. So for example, when we ask a question, we often use a rising intonation, like, are you going to the party? Now, when we make a statement, we have either a flat or a falling intonation contour. So if you look at this intonation contour here, I went to the store, for example, we don't have that rising intonation at the end of it. So we use intonation for different linguistic functions, okay? Now, also as a part of this discussion with prosody is the idea of stress and stress patterns. And we've talked about stress quite a bit. And we had an introduction to it, especially at the beginning, we're talking about syllables. And we talked about it when we transcribe, for example, the central vowels. We have to make sure that we know where the stress in a word falls. And we're going to talk about it some more because it's very important to our language because we are a stress time language. So we emphasize different syllables with different stress. So just to remind you of the definition, it's emphasis that could be given to a syllable, to a word, to a phrase, to an entire sentence. And we use stress in our prosody to make certain words stand out. So let me give you an example. So if you just read these two sentences, they're the same. But if you read them with different stress on certain words, so in this example on the pronouns, you're going to have a different meaning. So if I said, she told me that he took the last cookie, I'm emphasizing, what am I emphasizing here? Think about it for a minute. I'm emphasizing that this person, so let's say that person was in the room, she told me that he took the last cookie. I'm emphasizing she's the one who was the tattletale, for example. Now, if I said it with emphasis on the pronoun he, she told me that he took the last cookie. Now, it has a whole totally different meaning. Now I'm emphasizing who's the person who took the last cookie, right? So you can see how where you put the stress is going to change the meaning of a sentence when we're changing stress patterns across an entire phrase. Okay. Now, when we talk about stress in relation to speech production, we're talking about the increased loudness, increase the pitch, and how long we, the length of the sound. So we talked about it with syllables already, and we'll talk about it again. So it increases the intensity of a syllable. It can increase the fundamental frequency. So we looked at spectrograms before and how they may differ depending on where we put stress. And as I mentioned, we are a stress time language. So different stress and syllables is going to change even how we transcribe them in IPA. All right. So your textbook talks about the different ways that we can mark stress. So in IPA, stress is marked, as you can see, with a little line above which syllable is stressed. And you could have primary stress and secondary stress, and depending on how long the word is, even tertiary stress. Now, your textbook mentions that they prefer numbers to be used to make it clearer. So the textbook is marking stress with putting a number over which syllable, over the vowel for which syllable has primary stress. And then they're using other numbers, 2 for secondary stress. And then if there's multiple syllables, then 3 for tertiary stress. So you will often, if you look up a word, for example, so last year I was learning Italian, and it's very difficult when you're learning another language where to put the stress, because other languages have different stress patterns. So Italian is more towards a syllable time language than a stress time language, meaning that the syllables often carry equal stress, but not all the time. So sometimes in a multisyllabic word, you really have to know where to put the stress because it will change what the word means. I'm going to give you an example in a minute of this in English. So I looked up some words in an app called Word Reference, and it gives you the IPA transcription for the words so you know how to pronounce them, but it also marks which syllable the stress is on. And it's often in the IPA version. So I just want to make you aware of what you're going to commonly see. Okay. Another aspect of suprasegmentals is timing. So your textbook talked about tempo. We often think of tempo when we're thinking of music, for example, but in speech, tempo is the rate of speech. And this overarching idea of tempo includes not just the rate, but it also includes the pauses that we take and how we may lengthen, for example, a syllable or part of a phrase. So one of the things that we have to keep in mind with speaking rate is as we increase our speaking rate, the duration of speech units is decreased. And what that means is that we often will change different units within a word. So for example, vowels are particularly affected by this, where we will reduce that vowel so much that sometimes it becomes a schwa. So when we're talking fast, we're not making very precise articulation contact. So vowels often are the sounds that get reduced, and that's really what the schwa is. It's the most reduced sound. So it often occurs when we're transcribing conversational speech. Undershoot is a term that they used in the book, and that is that reduction in the articulation movement. So it's not quite as precise as it would be if you were really emphasizing each sound. Now, we don't want to necessarily really emphasize each sound in connected speech, because then we're going to sound robotic, right? Because that's not how we talk. Co-articulation is a normal part of conversational speech. So just to kind of tie it into why it's important to you, as some of you as future speech pathologists, is that rate changes very much along with the development timelines. So children are learning to process speech, along their development timeline. So before 2 years old, they can process at a pretty low rate. And once they get into preschool, it improves a little bit. So 120 to 124 words per minute is the average rate that children can process speech. And then, as you can see, once they get into school age and enter kindergarten, then they improve a little bit more. So we're up to about 130 words per minute. The problem is that adults, including myself, I've been told, speak at a very rapid rate. Depending on what part of the country you're from, or even what part of the world you're from, speech rates can vary. So we have to be conscious of this when we're talking to young children, that we're using an appropriate speech rate that they can process. Okay. Another aspect that the book talked about was pauses. They refer to them as junctures. So this is an important part of, I told you, the social communication umbrella that this all falls under. So being able to take a pause in a conversation to let someone else speak is a good social skill, right? You have to learn how to take turns. Young children are not very good at this, right? They don't know how to take turns. Some adults are not very great at this either. So if you look at the average time between conversational turns, it's 200 milliseconds. And this is a number that was derived across research among many countries. You could see the sources there. Now, there are differences, obviously, and this is where culture comes into suprasegmentals. For example, in Japan, it's considered polite to pause to show a sign of respect when someone asks you a question, shows that you're thoughtfully considering it. Now, these pauses can last up to 8 seconds, which we don't do in our culture. When I say our culture, I mean here in the United States, we are at that very quick turn taking. So I'm just going to tell you a quick story. I was on a board, a nonprofit board, and we had a member who had lived in Japan for 15 years. So when we would ask him a question, it seemed like he was taking an inordinate amount of time to answer. And he eventually just explained to us that it was after living in a country for 15 years, he was used to this style of pausing. So just something to consider. Okay. Another area under the suprasegmentals is loudness. And I mentioned that although this can be something that we think of as mechanical, that we can measure, how loud somebody's talking, we also want to think about this from a pragmatics perspective. So loudness could also be someone has difficulty if they have weakness. We call this dysarthria in speech pathology terms, that they have weakness, so they cannot speak loud. But we can perceive it also from a social communication perspective if someone does not speak loud enough to be heard, or they speak too loud all the time. Okay, so there's differences in prosody depending also on who we're talking to. So adults will change how they talk when they're talking to children, young children, I should say. And this is that we call this motherese. It's also called child-directed speech or infant-directed speech. So it means the same thing. And what it is, it's a slower pace. It's kind of a sing-songy voice, and it's a high-pitched. We also talk to pets this way. So, and research has found that pets, as well as people, young children, respond to this type of child-directed speech. So an example would be if you were standing behind somebody in a store and they were holding a cute puppy or a cute baby, you would use a different type of prosodic intonation contour to talk to that child. So you might say, "Oh, look at you, aren't you sweet little cutie pie?" So that is not how I would talk to an adult standing in front of me in line, or they might think I was a little cuckoo. Now, this is very important, not just from a developmental perspective. It's important because children's brains, when they're very young, tune into this child-directed speech. And research shows that the more they tune into it, the better their language is. And likewise, the children who don't tune into it are children who tend to have worse language outcomes. So, for example, in a social communication disorder such as autism, or many children have difficulty learning language, brain scans show that their brain is not tuning into that prosodic variation. Okay. So prosody is also important because prosody, those intonation contours, are what signify different structures. So for example, small words, such as the articles and the versus content words, which are typically longer. So children are able to identify where one word begins and another word ends using prosodic contours. Um, we also learn to adjust our prosody depending on who we're talking to. So we might talk to someone who's a president of our company that we're working at using a more formal prosody contour than if we're talking to one of our best friends, for example. The book talks about clear versus conversational speech. So we tend to adjust our speech depending on the environment we're in. So if we're in a noisy environment, we don't even really think about it. We just adjust. We start using a slower rate of speech. We may put more emphasis. We may raise a volume so that the person that we're talking to can recognize what we're saying. Conversational speech, as we had already talked about, we see that reduction in the vowels, sometimes to the point of a vowel becoming a schwa, and we don't necessarily precisely articulate each sound. Okay, so that's it for our discussion on suprasegmentals, and I will see you in the next lecture.